Hey, this is Aaron.
And Blake, we're AB Data.
Thanks for walking through this Alteryx Weekly challenge with us.
In this video, we're taking a look at Alteryx Weekly Challenge number 228, Know Your Boundaries. This is a fun spatial weekly challenge where we're given the polygons of the 10 states that border the Mississippi River, as well as the start and end points as separate data inputs. And we are tasked with using the Alteryx spatial tools to define the boundary, the intersection between these groups of states that makes up the Mississippi River, and then cut that region by the start and end points. So if you'd like to follow along, we're in the Alteryx Academy Weekly Challenge number 228. Taking a look at the start file, we have our two inputs on the left, starting with the states.yxdb. So here we have individual polygons representing the 10 states that border the Mississippi River. And then we're given small polygons representing the start and end points of the Mississippi River. From the headwaters up by St. Paul, Minnesota, down just north of New Orleans. And the output is a polygon that approximates the shape of the Mississippi River from start to finish. So to help us map the states on the east and west sides of the river, I've created a small lookup table to indicate these 10 states, whether they lie on the east or the west. And once we bring in the join tool, we can quickly map in the type. So let's add a browse tool here and see why this is a valuable piece of information. So by highlighting all of the states on the west side of the river, you can see ultimately we're going to want to separate these polygons into two groups, one on the east side, one on the west side, and we can define the intersection between the two as the Mississippi River boundary. So here, using the crosstab tool, we're changing the shape of the data table to give us one field for east and one field for west. Now that we have two independent fields with our east states and our west states organized, we can summarize those spatial objects using a spatial action called combine. So this will flatten our data table into two fields, one for the east, one for the west. And we're really interested in the intersection, the boundary in between these two spatial objects. So before we ask Alteryx to define the boundary, I'm just going to add a buffer to one of our spatial objects of a mile. That way, when we do define the intersection, there is a bit of a boundary that overlaps, as our starting polygons don't have any intersection between them. So by adding a 1 mile buffer, this will make our intersection object a little bit more interesting to look at. So using our spatial process tool, we can ask Alteryx to define the intersection between the east and west. And just to make it easier to view the spatial object that we are trying to create, I'm going to drop in a select tool and define that spatial process output as the Mississippi so far. We're not done, we still have some work to do, as this includes the region north of St. Paul and south of Baton Rouge on down to New Orleans. But we're essentially done using that first data input, so I'll go ahead and add these tools to a tool container. We'll define this as the section where we're creating the so-called line object for the Mississippi River. This is actually a polygon or a region, but we can think of a river as a line for this object. That's fine. So we have this polygon created. Now we need to add the start and end points and then chop it into different regions so we can isolate the portion that only covers the Mississippi River. So we want to chop out that area north of St. Paul and south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. All right, so our second input is a map input containing our start and end polygons. And once again, we're using the crosstab tool just to change the shape of our data table. So we want to have independent points or independent fields for our start and end points. And And now I'm going to append the shape for the Mississippi River so far to these two new fields. So we have the start, the end, and we have the Mississippi polygon that has too much area associated with it. So we need to use the end and the start as cutoff points. So we're literally going to cut one shape from the other, again using the spatial process tool, but defining a different action. So instead of creating an intersection object, this time we'll start with the end. Doesn't matter which one we start with. We can do this starting with the end and the beginning, or vice versa. And let me go ahead and zoom in, and we can see the output of our spatial process tool. And to help us really visualize what's happening at this step, I'm going to drop in a select tool just to clean up the view that my browse tool is giving me so we can see the new regions that are created. So if I highlight that Mississippi region and we zoom on down towards the end of the Mississippi River, we'll see that our polygon is actually cut right at that river endpoint. So downstream, we're going to be able to use a tool called polysplit to take this field and break it into different spatial regions. So having that break in our polygon for the Mississippi River is very valuable to us. So we'll use the same set of tools, another spatial process to this time cut the start polygon from our Mississippi River. I'll go ahead and just copy and paste my little select tool to help us keep our field names clean and help us visualize each aspect of this region. So let's take a look at our new shape for the Mississippi. It still contains too much area, so we don't want the region that's north of Prescott, around the St. Paul area. But now we do have a break in the region, so we have three distinct regions, one north of the river itself, and then one south of the river. And we can use our polysplit tool to take this one field and break it into separate regions. So we will switch our split to action. Instead of a series of points, we want to see three distinct regions. And here, as we highlight them in the browse tool, we can see the regions that are created by our polysplit tool. We're only concerned with that region in the middle. We could use two sample tools. We could use a select records tool. I chose to drop in a record ID tool and then a filter to tell Alteryx to only keep record ID 2 in that middle position. And our new polygon should be a nice approximation of the Mississippi River. So zooming into the headwaters area, we can see that our boundary is set. And if we do the cooking show approach when it comes to documentation and annotations, here we've got two distinct tool containers where we're first creating the spatial object for the river and then mapping in the start and end points and using that spatial process tool along with polysplit to cut it into regions and isolate the river itself.
Thank you for learning with us today. Good luck on your Alteryx journey.
For more information on custom training, managed service automations, and more, please visit our website at abdataconsulting.com.